Still won't be. You are live. Okay.
Welcome back to Ways and Means. We had technical difficulties, but we're up and running. And we're happy to say the whole committee is here. We're ready to start. We're going to hear on the foundation formula. Sue Siglowski is not here.
No, we have an email, so we couldn't make it.
Okay. Jay Nichols.
I think you missed people this morning still.
No, we didn't.
Oh, I thought you're a fan of. Oh,
That was an old sheet.
okay. I didn't know that. All right, we'll keep it brief because I know you're a little behind. So I'm gonna probably type up 4 or 5 pages of notes for you, which I'm not gonna get through right now. I'm serious about that. But right now, I'm just gonna share a couple of quick thoughts based on the testimony from Candy Gold. So for the record, Jay Nichols, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association. So some questions kind of arose, when I was listening to Tammy today. I just want you to think about. First is around, and I will put this on writing, the question of scale. So I'm questioning why we would provide an extra $2,157 per student for schools with under 100 students, if the goal is scale. I'm not saying that has to be the goal. That's up to you folks, but from reading 454, it sounds like the goal of that is, at least in part, to provide scale for larger districts throughout the state and more student opportunity, as well as to hopefully bend the curve on cost. And again, that's a policy choice. You guys get to decide, but I want you to be thinking about that if you decide to go down the road of the way the bill came out of Health Ed. You know, do you really want to incentivize keeping smaller schools? I do think we have to support small schools that are small because of sparsity or geographical necessity, but I question extra per pupil funds for choosing to be small. Similarly, I don't think we should give extra per pupil funds simply for places that choose to be really large. I just think we want to be fair base. Rep. Odie's question about underfunding. I think that's why we need to make sure there's an inflator that's appropriate, and the General Assembly needs to make sure education is funded at the formula level that is prescribed in whatever comes out of this body this year. If the goal of this transforming education plan is multifaceted with the hopes of improving scale and thus opportunities for students, as well as bending the cost spending curve and providing for greater sustainability, then we should make sure that all of our policy decisions work toward that end. ELL weights, I know these are kind of, I will make it more coherent when I write it. I like the idea of developing a more refined ELL weighting system, as Dr. Colby has indicated. The need of ELL students does vary widely, having been a principal and a superintendent with ELL students. And so therefore the cost of the necessary services also varies greatly. It's especially acute during the first couple of years in which the students move to the country or moved into the school system. So I really think that we want to make sure that we really fund that appropriately well. And I think when you have good instruction, the cost does tend to go down over a few years. I can think of one kid when I was in South Burlington that went on to be the valedictorian. So with proper instruction, they can really do well. Special education, I'd like to see the Vermont Council of Special Education Administrators weigh in on the 3 approaches that Dr. Colby talked about in terms of funding. Without being an expert in this area whatsoever, I do like the 3 levels: low cost, medium cost, and high cost, only because I think it's more likely to connect actual cost levels, actual need for students' services, at least on the average. Again, I think she said over and over, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be a perfect match. But I think this comes a lot closer to one number, like an additive weight of 0.79 for the things they talked about. I would much rather see you go a little bit more nuanced approach. I think that would be better in the long run for most kids. Independent and public schools, we feel they need to be treated equitably. The BPA, we always say same dollars, same rules, been saying it for years. We're going to continue to run parallel systems. We need to make sure the funding system and the services required are equitable and the rules are the same for both. CTEs, I'm worried about underfunding CTEs. I know that's not what you're talking about right now, but I want to make sure that people realize the need there is really great. We've got lots of waiting lists in the state. We've got kids that can't get into programs, and we need to fund CTE more, and we need to find more solutions for. We may need to build more CTE centers, quite frankly, or add construction for ones that are there. The inflator. I talked the other day in here about the 2 different indexes and was told that NEPA was basically the way it is set in most Vermont law. And now after hearing about ECI, I'm just gonna say, can you look at that? Because, 80% of our budgets in every school district on average are related to compensation. And a big part of that is health insurance. And as you know, health insurance keeps increasing at what I believe are unsustainable rates. And so I would love to see some type of a inflator that brings in the fact of what the actual is happening in terms of employees compensation. So if we could take a look at that or put some type of special health insurance indicator that's on top, that'd be okay too. And I have a bunch more that I wrote last night that I don't think I'm going to share with you right now. It's more general, not related to what Tammy talked about. And I think you want to focus on funding more than anything else today. So I'm just going to, at that point, stop there and open it up for any questions you might have.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. Mr. Nichols, I was thinking, for health insurance, instead of a vague inflator or whatever, because it's out of the hands of school boards, maybe it should just be the actual increase that's put in there.
I mean, that's a possibility. It'd have to be a one-year trailer, probably because of when way budgets are developed and things like that.
Well, if there are multi-year contracts settled, the last contract was a 3-year contract. And
We don't know the health insurance, but
Oh, that's true.
so we get that each year and we know what that percentage is and then we build them into the budgets, but that doesn't.
so the exact amount, but with a 1 year lag.
Yeah, I mean, I think something like that's worth considering if we're not addressing any cost drivers, even with the health plan, which our organization overall finds certainly the best of the 3 plans that we've seen. We think the other 2 are nonsensical in terms of opportunities for kids. The health plan at least has, some opportunities for kids. We think if it's done well. We'd rather stay the way we are right now and do nothing different than go to a plan that's we think is gonna really underfund and hurt the education system in the state of Vermont. So I like that concept for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Representative Holcomb.
So one of the things we've talked about is that we do have very, very low ratios. What works why is it that we get persistent and low ratios?
We have really small schools. I think that's the biggest reason. We have a lot of what I would call micro schools that are not very big. And I think we do need scale. From my research I've done over my career, schools that are really small oftentimes don't have many opportunities for kids. And I think that the most important thing is opportunities for kids. I also think there's also a nuance there when you talk about elementary school versus a middle school or high school. I mean, I would want my middle school or high school kid going to a school of 2, 3, 4, 500 kids at least. Elementary, if it's a school of 100 and it's a K-3, maybe that's okay. But when you start having 7, 8 kids in a class, you're in the same peer group all the time. If you're in a town that's K-6 or K-8, you never see other kids. There's no instructional research that supports that. When Hattie talks about that's the number one researcher for student achievement, John Hattie. And he's done tons of, what he does, he takes all different research studies, and he does what are called meta-analysis, brings them together and comes up with here's the impact over millions of kids when you do X. For example, class size, for example, is like a standard deviation like 0.23. So is it valid? Absolutely. But it's not nearly as important as a teacher setting goals with their kids every day and making sure the kids understand the goals. So good teaching is going to always be better, I think, than I would rather have a really good teacher with 20 kids than a weak teacher with 10 kids any day of the week. So I do think there's scale in there. I think smaller class sizes is great. I think the numbers that the House has put in there those are pretty small class sizes. I think those are all pretty good numbers to work. I think you get much smaller than that. I think it's really hard to do groupings of students and stuff that really the instructional pedagogy says that we should try to do. You've got 7 kids, it's pretty hard to break them up to lots of different groups in a class. So I do think that's difficult. But I do think it's a scale question. I think that's a big part of it. I also think, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I also think that our schools are taking on more and more things that used to be done by, the Agency of Human Services, CDD, those types of things. And kids come to school every day. We constantly get told that this kid's parent refuses to let them get services that they need outside of school. They won't let them have the mental health services they need. And other mental health organizations will say, well, if the kid and the family won't participate, then we just can't do anything for them. That kid still comes to school the next day. We've had kids that have been in emergency rooms for 3-4 weeks at a time because there's no placement for them. So schools do the best they can with what they have. Our teachers are not mental health clinicians. And they've been asked to do a lot of societal work that Not fair to them. And my principals will tell you all the time that teachers are working very hard to try to provide support for kids. Much of that is things that they haven't been trained to do.
Representative Wazazi.
As a follow-up to that, would it be fair to characterize your organization's position as the fact that we're using the schools to help children access these social services is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a very convenient,
We have to-
logical thing to do.
We have to-
The issue is who's being asked to do the work and how much money is following it.
Yeah, it's those two issues. It's the funding piece of it, and it's asked who's, not only who's being asked to do the work, but where's the training for them to help them be able to do the work in a way that's going to be effective for the kids that they're trying to serve.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. If you were a school and you had under a foundation formula, more money coming per pupil than you had before the foundation formula, what kind of help would you be hoping to get so you'd know what to do with the extra resources?
It's a great question. I think it's going to be context dependent. If I think back to the last place where I was superintendent, there's such a need for mental health services there. I mean, I would be looking to try to hire clinicians that could really provide extra support to kids. I'd also be looking to try to do more co-teaching models, especially in the grades K1, 2, 3. One of the things we found since the pandemic is that we have more and more students coming into school that have lots of issues with executive functioning and emotional regulation. And so I would really try to hit really hard in K1, 2, 3, giving those kids those skills that they need, because they're not ever going to reach the academic promise they have. It's Maslow's hierarchy needs. We got to meet them where they're at. We've got to make sure they get the services that they need so that they can become academically really strong. I think that's where I would focus. That's just me, though.
That sounds excellent. I was looking at the science reading techniques.
Yeah, I think a lot of our teachers, more teachers are moving towards the science of reading techniques. It's not something that's being taught in all of our colleges and universities without
No.
outing anybody. I'll bring that up. Yeah, that's true. As a teacher, you typically are going to teach reading the way that you were taught reading. And for most teachers, including myself, school was something that, oh, school's great, we like it. But for the kids where it's really difficult, sometimes there are research-based strategies that need to be used that should be used. So certainly something that should be looked at in pre-training for teachers.
Representative Brannigan.
So, Jane, for the sake of the whole committee, can you please tell us what executive function is and the other thing?
Yeah, so really what I'm talking about here, executive functioning is more about, in this case, with younger kids, talk about the ability to think things through and make choices and to regulate your own behavior. And so what happens with a lot of our younger kids that come to schools today, we have kids that flip over tables. Last year, we had a principal out for weeks because a kid punched her and gave her a concussion. So, there's some of that that's out there. It usually comes down to a kid's needs are somehow not being met. Nobody, certainly not the school's fault. And the kid just cannot control their emotions. And trying to give them, it's usually somebody with mental health skills and background that can provide training to them, support to them, and teach them skills. And I, as a teacher, I would never be trained in how to do that. So we need that support for mental health services. In some parts of the state, we have really strong mental health services. Other parts, it's almost non-existent.
These are things children would learn at home.
These are things that you would want children to learn at home. They don't always learn at home.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Janet.
Good afternoon. Jack, I know you're on a tight schedule. For the record, Jeff Fannin, Executive Director of Vermont NEA. Thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time today. I don't have written remarks, I have written notes. And happy to come back after we've had a chance to look at Professor Colby's number and her whole presentation. I have not had a chance to review it, just put it out there, and was trying to look for it this morning. It wasn't there. So I'd like to reserve my my time, if you will, to come back at another time. I know that you're pressed for your time, so I'll just press ahead as I had prepared, without having seen those numbers. And those numbers do matter significantly, obviously. That's why the room is crowded. People are very concerned about the property tax and this whole system of how we educate our Vermont children. I'll go back to one of the questions I heard earlier, and I think it was from Representative Holcomb. what is it? Why is it we have small classes? I'd say we have a small state and we have a demographic problem that we haven't begun to address. And it's larger than the school system. It's a statewide issue. So unless we get real about that, I think we're going to continue to have troubles in other areas, schools being one. And so we need to address the demographic problem in the state and figure that out. So it's a quick aside here. I'm not sure where you all landed on what I think you're calling the supplemental spending.
Supplemental district spending.
Thank you. I won't use the former name, formerly known as. But and above spending above that amount. But it would be good to see some language on that and really flesh that out, because I think that will matter, because some schools will need or want to do more for their kids, and how we address that, how you address that, and how we address that as a state is going to be important, because some kids need more, and obviously the weights do matter and do help, but there's more to it, and some communities really need to figure that out. But we need to do it in a way that's compliant with Brigham, to say that, and looking at that will be important. We're not enamored with the governor's property tax credit approach. We like your approach better. I'm just going to put that out there. But I'll say this, we are firm in our belief, and we know from substantial polling that Vermonters like their local community schools overwhelmingly. And they overwhelmingly do not like how we pay for it. They do not like the property tax. And so I've been in this committee a couple of times and said this on a broken record on this perhaps. We think when we urge you to look at lowering property taxes right now, immediately for 50,000 working class families by adjusting the income sensitivity numbers for inflation, which has never happened. And that we think there's a simple solution that needs to happen and should happen. It would lower the taxes for 50,000 working class Vermonters right now. So I think that's meaningful property reduction for people who need it most. To your earlier conversation about what's coming out of the Ed Fund and with Jay about mental health services, take a look at what is now coming out of the Education Fund that was not previously. Been around this building long enough to know that things have been added over the many years, including mental health. And why is that? So during the pandemic, we were regularly meeting with the then Secretary of Agency of Human Services. And we were told that the state's mental health system had collapsed in the Northeast Kingdom. And it was likely to, flow throughout other parts of the state. Chittenden County seems to be operating well with a substantial system in place, but other parts of the state are not. And that ends up on schools because they deal with those kids and they deal with every kid, as Jay indicated, because they can and they should. We don't think that's, to your point earlier, Representative Wozniak, it is important that they do that. I'm sorry. That schools meet every kid's needs as they come into the building, but how we pay for it is the issue. For years, that was under the general fund. It's now been shifted to the Ed Fund. Last year, February of last year, in this committee, Nicole Lee, who was then working for the Agency of Education, said the increase one year was between $50 and $60 million, and mental health increases from the general fund to the Ed Fund. And we still haven't looked at that and examined that and really need to think about that critically. That was what the administration said, between 50 and 60 million to this committee in February of last year. So that's important. What is coming out of the Ed Fund that was not previously, and taking a look at that and adjusting for that, and not penalizing property taxpayers for that, but owning up to that. Because when you went to the all sales tax and stopped with the general fund transfer, there were things that were not coming out of the Ed Fund that are now, or sizably increasing. So that needs to be adjusted. And lastly, we would suggest that you move to the income tax with which to fund public education. It is what voters want. It is simpler, and then frankly, it's more equitable. So we remain firm in the belief that it can be done. Nobody's going to tell me, I've heard it is too complex to go to that. Tell me, if you look at the current property tax system, it's not complex. It's complex as anything. And to believe me, I know that there's been some discussion that the income tax cannot happen. It's too difficult. Actually, my read of what was studied a couple of years ago, and you can talk to the people who are on that, and I think your chair and one Representative Kleppner were on that. I think there are ways to do it. Are there challenges? You bet. Are there challenges with the current system? Absolutely. And I think we ought to move to the income tax. It's fair. It's simpler. People want it, and they understand it. So one way to lower property taxes right now, there was discussion earlier about healthcare. Nobody's talking about reference-based pricing. It would reduce property taxes $52 million in 26. $52 million of property tax reduction if we move to reference-based pricing. That was studied in the Oliver Wyman report of last September, the Green Mountain Care Board, and more recently, Brown University. This is not difficult. I mean, it's difficult in some sense of the word, but other states have done it, including some states that are red and blue. It's across the political spectrum. We have the highest insurance rates in the country, with the highest hospital costs in the country. And it's a huge driver for public school system, and we need to get serious about it. And reference-based pricing would do it. So I'm hoping somewhere in the body that will move. It's $52 million property tax reduction in 26. We can do it. And lastly, I will say that with all the changes that are coming out of Washington, I'm urging a sense of slow down. I know that everybody's rushing towards something, whatever that may be, but all the changes in DC are significant and upsetting schools, local municipalities, and in the state as a whole. Today, for example, I believe the state of Vermont now has, as all states do, 10 days in which to respond to the federal government to say whether or not they're doing any more diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And if they don't affirm they're not, then they lose federal funding. And I don't know the details of this. It just came out today. I'll remind everybody here that we passed in 2019 Act 1, which led to the education quality standards being revised, which are effective, I believe, July 1, 2025. So that's getting ready to start to make our schools more inclusive and aware of our racial equity issues in our state generally, and looking back and looking forward. And so that's a law, the state of Vermont, that schools are required to do. And now we've got a mandate perhaps, or some sort of directive from the federal agency of education to assert that they're not doing that work. How we square those two, I do not know. But I'd suggest to you that we need to be careful and intentional about what we do and how we do it as we change the education delivery system in Vermont, because there's a lot of moving parts here. And again, I'll revert back to people like their local schools right now in Vermont. They tremendously do. They just don't like how we pay for it. So we're adding a lot of changes in the system. If you're a scientist, you change one variable and you examine it. You don't change 5 or 10 at the same time and then look back and see how did it work, because you have no idea whether it was the 5 or 10, which one of the 5 or 10 was the influencing factor. And so you've got to change things incrementally. I know that sounds abhorrent to some people in this state, but it is truly how you do it thoughtfully and intentionally. And so I'm urging a sense of slow down and not harm the system, which is under great stress in state as well as federally. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have. That's the sum of my conversation. I'm happy to look at the Tammy Colby presentation materials and comment later too, but I know you're moving quickly.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chelsea Myers.
Next. Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. Thank you for inviting testimony. Given the quick turnaround of the Professor Colby's presentation, and now we haven't had a chance to really dive into the numbers, I would like to state that our Board of Trustees, which comprises of 9 superintendents from around the state, is meeting with the Vermont Association of School Business Officers leadership to do a deeper dive into what these numbers mean and their implications. So we look forward to doing that, and hopefully I can provide you with either additional testimony or something in writing. But for now, here are some core points. The funding formula must align with the education policy goals set forth by this body. For example, if we are trying to achieve scale, what weighting structure aligns with this new scale? Will we create any perverse incentives antithetical to best practice in this model? Concentrated support for school systems is the antidote to that. So as an example, like looking at how we change weighting of special education, right? That needs to be followed with best practices and the proper staffing of special education. The weighting really is contingent that the best practices are followed so that we do not create any perverse incentives. When we think about the new system, it is likely that those that are spending below the base amount currently will face tax increases in those communities. Will the tax impact be by community be modeled in any way? I've heard that it's going to be modeled by district, but one of the concerns in some of our lower spending districts right now is that the taxes, as they come up to the base amount, will rise pretty sharply, and what that means for those communities. Will there be allowable or disallowable uses of supplemental district spending? I know you've talked a little bit about that question. Seems like maybe you're leaning not to do that, but I would ask the question, to what extent are we saying that some communities who vote for it, once again, have the ability to spend more on certain opportunities that neighboring communities would not be able to get their community to favor in the polls? If you do permit supplemental district spending, we ask that you maintain the commitment that all or some of that funding supports school construction aid. This is an essential component of the education policy goals expressed so far by this body and a tremendous need. Just yesterday or just last week, we learned that there was a federal shift to liquidation of COVID ESSER dollars. And that's having a significant impact on some district communities, not being able to realize those dollars. And many of them have to do with school construction projects like HVAC systems that were started, but are just kind of slow to materialize because of labor shortages and things like that. So school construction remains one of our top policy priorities. I have said this previously, but want to continue to stress that understanding how the disparate contracts that we have currently will have on implementation of a foundation formula is essential. And then related to staffing, some districts will inevitably be provided more resources through this process, which is warranted. How will we address the staffing shortages in some licensing and geographic areas to ensure that the equity in funding results in high quality experiences for students? In other words, we've done a lot of talking about scale, about foundation formula, but what we haven't done is talked about the inequity around staffing levels around the state and the ability to recruit highly trained educators in certain parts and in certain disciplines in this state. So one thing that we haven't really considered too much in this, but is essential. These are some of the questions that we will be analyzing in detail tomorrow at our board meeting, and I would be happy to write up that testimony with our findings.
Thank you. What?
Theoretically,
Yes.
if we didn't spend more money, if our costs didn't go up, then you wouldn't have a tax impact on communities. There wouldn't be one if we didn't spend more money. Is it your testimony that by going to a foundation formula, we actually would increase spending?
Well, that's wholly dependent on the state level. That's wholly dependent on how much the model dictates that you spend across the current operating structure. What I think the concern is that in local towns, is there going to be a significant tax requirement that goes up? For example, if you
Based on
are.
what they're spending now. and
Exactly.
Spending and.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, so that's the question,
Yeah.
not necessarily the statewide.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
made my job easy.
We're gonna have Stephanie Yu. About the homestead exemption.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. I'll keep it brief. I'm Stephanie Yu from Public Assets Institute. Thanks for having me back again. I just want to touch base on our thoughts about the homestead exemption proposal and some of the analysis that we've done on it. And I have a couple slides, but I'll get to those in a minute. So from our perspective, the biggest issue is that any homestead exemption structure perpetuates the regressivity of the current system, meaning that higher income taxpayers pay a smaller share of their income in school taxes than middle income Vermonters. So at whatever point that exemption phases out, taxpayers above that income point will continue to pay their school taxes based on property value, which is a regressive tax. And the flip side of that is that we're foregoing the revenue that would be brought in from taxing those taxpayers with the most income based on their income. The second piece is that because higher income taxpayers are essentially held harmless under this plan, it's really just redistributing the taxes among Vermonters under 115,000 in household income and creating different winners and losers. In aggregate, the group will bear a similar share of the taxes, it just creates different inequities. Even if this does reduce the group's taxes by the estimated, I think it was 45 million that Julia cited from JFO, unless you're expressly shifting that cost onto higher income taxpayers, you really haven't changed the fundamental unfairness in who pays. And one of those inequities created by this plan is that taxpayers with the same income will have very different tax bills because they're driven by the value of the primary home rather than their ability to pay. The way the current system works, taxpayers with the same income who qualify for income sensitivity, which, as you know, this year is under about 115 in household income. They have the same bill if their towns have the same per pupil spending and their income is below 90,000 and their home value below 400,000, which is about 70% of those taxpayers under 115,000. So most of them are sort of subject to the same rules now. But under this proposed plan, the tax bills would vary across the income level, across the same incomes based on property value, which adds more complexity to the system. Fourth, because it's still based on that property tax, it's retaining all of the complexity and frustration with the current property tax system. So the CLA, the disconnect between bills and school budgets, and it's also retaining all of the complexity of the current hybrid system because it's still based on that interaction between income and property value. So people will still need to sort of cross-reference their incomes, their property values, the local CLA, and the exemption levels to really understand their taxes. So I want to share I just have a couple quick slides to share. Let me see. And I think what's important to note about these slides is less sort of all of the details and more the shape of how they look, right? So in both the current and the proposed systems, the middle income Vermonters are paying the biggest share of their income in school taxes. So the regressivity is going to carry forward into the new system. And you're really going to see this peak at the middle. So this is what the current system looks like. And you can see pretty clearly those cliffs we've talked about before, the cliff at that 90,000 mark. That's what's happening in the current system. Again, this is different home values across the income spectrum. But in the proposed system, this is what that looks like. So again, I think the most important thing to take away from these charts is really the shape. It peaks in the middle, right? Right around that exemption point, wherever that phase out point might be, those people are going to be the people paying the biggest share of their income in school taxes. And again, these charts aren't trying to be comprehensive in the sense of we know exactly what every interaction is going to be, what every taxpayer's income and property value, how that will play out. But the point is that the shape stays the same. The peak is in the middle. And the other piece of this is that the ability to pay is no longer the main driver of the tax bill. So across the same income level, taxpayers will have very different bills. They have the same ability to pay, but their bills will really range. So take 3 homeowners who all have the same income, right around the state median, which is about 80,000. Right now, they're paying just over $2,000 in taxes if their homes are under 400,000. But under this exemption proposal, a homeowner at that income level, 80,000, with a $250,000 house would pay a similar amount, around 2,000. But somebody at the median house value of about 340 would pay almost $2,700, and somebody with a $400,000 house would pay over $3,000. So that's a pretty big range of bills for people with the same ability to pay. Again, this is while homeowners above 115,000 are held harmless. So there's a lot of changes happening for the taxpayers under 115,000, but not for those who can best afford to pay more. And I know I showed this slide, I think was that last week, but I want to kind of look at it from another angle, which is that any system that starts with a property tax on primary homes is really punishing those people whose primary home is their main asset, which is most people, right? Up through about the 80th percentile of income, the primary home value tends to be higher than taxpayers' net worth. That's both because most of them have mortgages alongside other debt. So at the low end, the primary home value could be 8, 9, 10 times the net worth, and the net worth can even be negative. And even somebody as high as the 80th percentile in income, which is right around that 115,000 mark, their home value is still more than their net worth. So it's only at the high end of the income scale that the primary home value is actually a wholly positive asset and a subset of net worth. So we're assessing taxes on essentially phantom assets for most people. Even when you're exempting some portion of that primary home value, you're still starting with the property value, much of which is not actually owned by the homeowner and does not reflect their true wealth. And at the high end, that primary home value is 5, 10, 25% of the net worth, which is a small sliver of their total wealth. So we know we're only scratching the surface of their ability to pay, even while we're basing taxes for everybody else on much more than their worth. So just to wrap up, we keep coming back to the regressivity of the property tax. As long as you're starting with a property tax, you're perpetuating that regressivity. And as long as you perpetuate that regressivity, school taxes are going to put more pressure on low and moderate income Vermonters than they do on higher income Vermonters, which makes it harder for them to get kids what they need. Another way of looking at this is that you're comfortable with property tax bills driving Vermonters out of their homes if they can't afford to pay them. Rather than worrying about the possibility of exacerbating the housing crisis, there seems to be a sense that this will force Vermonters to right-size the cost of their homes. But the property value often grows faster than ability to pay, especially for low-wage workers and people on fixed incomes. And homes are long-term assets, so you're keeping them over decades potentially. So where the price was at the time of purchase and where it ends up over the life of your mortgage or over the life of your family's changing needs, those can really diverge. Not to mention the fact that, as we know, there aren't really more affordable homes available to people at the moment. So I want to acknowledge, I appreciate that this plan could cut taxes for a lot of Vermonters, but it would also raise them for quite a few moderate income Vermonters. And it would add a lot more variability and complexity to the system. Any plan that starts with property value fails to address the fundamental unfairness in how we pay for schools because it avoids asking higher income Vermonters to contribute as much to schools as everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Rebecca Samaroff.
Actually gonna be Jake Feldman from the tax department.
Jake Feldman.
I know the committee, to introduce myself, Jake Feldman, Tax Department. I know the committee is super busy this week, but if you want to talk again about education income taxes, we could come back maybe next week. We've talked about it quite a bit, but yeah, happy to revisit. So I do have a very quick group of slides for you. And again, thanks for continuing to work on this. We do like where it's headed a lot. And we think that the off-site limit should be $400,000, which is what it is in current law. And in the modeling that we saw with the $400,000 limit, even people in higher property values were tended to be doing a little bit better. So we would recommend that be the approach. In GFO's presentation, the $400,000 limit would cost $35 million compared to an unlimited exemption, which would be very unusual, which would cost $45 million. Okay, so I've listened to some of the committee's testimony on this, the conversation on this last couple of days, and I'm going back to a few major themes here. So what problems are we trying to solve? One big one, timeliness. With an exemption, it won't be lagged. It's going to be sensitive to the property value and the rates in the coming years. This is a big deal when there are reappraisals, and this is a big deal when there are rate changes, and it makes sense to do it this way. The current credit is lagged a year, which causes all kinds of confusion and problems. We wish we could move income up to the year too, but it's impossible to do because when you're filing, you have no idea what your income is going to be for the year. So it's not lagged. That's the first one. Fairness, the current system, Vermont's current system is hyper unusual in the country. In terms of where the benefit goes to high value properties. That's not the way other states do it. And there are a lot of very smart and very progressive states out there. They are not doing what Vermont does. Massachusetts exempts up to a third of the median house value for everybody. So what that means is if you're in a really low value property, you could have potentially fully exempt from property taxes. That's amazing. That's the flip opposite of what Vermont does. And Vermont's property tax credit system, if you're in a low value property, you would probably be getting very little or no benefit from the state. The benefit goes to where the property wealth is. That's how it works.
Not a big deal question, but
Sure.
Until he's done. Not until he's done.
Oh, okay. Third one, transparency. Going to an exemption will make it possible for school boards and voters to link their school budget decisions to tax bills. That's not possible now. I work at the tax department. I'm also on a school board, but it is impossible to try to capture the lagged property tax credit and try to tell people what their property taxes are going to be in the coming year. Totally impossible. So school boards don't even do it. They say, here's what the rates are going to be. And in our town, some people get an income-based credit, and that's where they leave it. So it's a major improvement for transparency. And I showed this table one time back at the beginning of the session. I had the flu, and then I came in and I showed it again, and I may have even showed it again to the joint Ways and Means plus Senate Finance. But the complexity in the current system around how people pay gives rise to misinformation and tax bill surprises. I know a lot of you have been on school boards and you probably heard something like, well, 2/3 of people pay based on income, so they don't need to worry about the budget. That's so far from the truth. The truth is that some people pay on income fixed rates because they get a circuit breaker. Some people pay on income variable rates because they're over 47,000. Some people pay hybrid, income and property, and some people pay just on property. And it's very difficult to sort out. And then add to that the fact that everyone's credit who gets one is lagged a year. So it's just very hyper confusing. So we are trying to clean that up. The last slide is just, we've heard the concern about the little white L. And when you put in the $400,000 limit, the white L turns into kind of a blob of losers in your tables, if you remember. The reason that that's happening is because among the bizarre parts of the current system is that there's a massive cliff at $90,000 of income. Your credit changes precipitously because before 90,000 of income, you're covered up to $400,000 of value. And after that, it only goes up to $225,000. So that can create up to a $3,000 liability difference. That's terrible policy. There's nothing different about a household with $89,999 of income and $90,001. So you guys in your step down are getting rid of that. It's gradual. You're trying to fit a staircase through a cliff, but that's causing distortions on either side. So the people right under 90,000 are losing in the white blob. And then right after that, people are winning quite a bit. So one idea for mitigating that is to phase in over 3 years, the exemption level right on either side of the cliff. You could do something like in this table where in the first year, there still is a cliff, but then in subsequent years, the cliff shrinks a little bit until it is that gradual step down that you guys have designed. So that's an idea. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's good. And the other thing I'd say about the cliff is that, you guys are thinking about, well, in year one, there are these distortions. And yes, those distortions are potentially there. But for the past 20 years, people have been falling off the cliff because there's a cliff that doesn't make any sense. So there's an opportunity here to fix it. And I like what you guys have done. I think it's great. Administratively, it's going to be a little bit easier for us. And I'm going to show you what the forms look like. It's a huge improvement. And our overall progressivity of our entire tax system will be the same or maybe even a little bit better. And so looking forward to keeping this moving.
Representative Odie.
Just had a quick question. When you were talking about Massachusetts, the benefits going to the highest value property in Vermont, in Massachusetts, 1/3 of the, can you say what?
Yeah, I went over that really
I
fast.
missed that.
So Massachusetts has a homestead exemption. It's not like this. They exempt for your county up to 1/3 of the median house value. So if the median house in some county in Massachusetts is 300,000, then that means every house would have $100,000 exempt.
So interesting that they do it by county.
Yeah.
Something I brought up.
Yes, that is what you were saying.
Representative Odie, that's an awesome idea.
Why, thank you.
But the thing is, I know the committee's trying to minimize winners and losers. And so when you start doing it that way, it's different than what we do now, and it creates more winners and losers. So in some ways, we're bound to what we do now if we want to minimize winners and losers, if that
Even
makes
within
sense.
a county, you would get more winners and losers. I'm most worried, I'm worried about everything, but I'm focusing on, the different, what could be vastly different fair market or appraised or assessed values from one area of the state, not necessarily county, but one area of the state versus another area of the state. So, and if we did something by areas, you still think that would make more winners and losers? I don't get it.
I think it would, because you're getting away from the current constraints, which are like, it's 400,000 everywhere and 225,000 everywhere, So those are the house site value limits. And if you started making them different in Chittenden County than Essex County, something funny is going to really happen. But I understand the motivation for
I
it.
was actually thinking about doing it. I wasn't thinking to the counties. I was thinking about our supplemental district spending and within those districts. So that you would have a relief system within the district that had to do with the median house value within the district. And that might help everybody contribute to a supplemental district spending in a fair way. That's what I was saying.
We should keep talking about it. I think, it's difficult to, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the eventual interactions between this and whatever happens with tax rates. And so this framework is good, but it should be revisited once there's a sense of what districts and funding systems are going to be like in a new world. Because this is the modeling that tax and JFO have done is like kind of patching it on FY25 and imagining FY25 again. But really you would want to look at the interactions of this and the eventual system.
And we have time. Thanks.
Representative Higley.
Mr. Chair, real quick, Jake, we're looking for that $35 million for increasing, where can we find it?
Treasurer's office, maybe? I have a lot of other things. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, $35 million.
That's on top of the 77 million and the 41 million that we're using to draw down rates this year. Right?
So that's for FY '26. This is for future year, potentially FY '28 or later. So I think a lot can change between now and then. And, you know, I think we should just kind of keep monitoring what direction we're headed with our different funding streams. But I think it's really important to give people a property tax system that they can make sense of. I think people deserve it. You know, that's basic.
Thanks.
Representative Kimball.
Chick, I'm wondering, and just looking at some historical numbers, it looks like the property tax credit in years past was about 10% of what the education fund was. Roughly. And then if we look at it now, it's under 7%. So just thinking that's because of rising incomes, the brackets have stayed the same, the values have actually come down. There's a lot of things at work there. So that fewer people may be qualifying for it. So I'm just trying to think, does the tax department have a point of view as to what the level of credit should be?
That's sort of a philosophical question. I mean, I think we're in agreement that we want to try to minimize distortions to people's bills as much as possible. You know, I think you're right about the reasons why. I think with the homestead exemption, it's pretty easy to index it. So, you know, you could keep it moving with things. Whereas the existing credit system, you know, you had the 47 and 90 income thresholds, which did not change for a very long time. I don't think the tax department has an official position on what share of the ed fund it should be.
Probably wasn't a fair question, so I admitted that. Just want to draw the percentage.
Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Chair. This is really helpful, and I really appreciate your focus on simplicity to avoid distortions, because I think that's a lesson we can take into a lot of arenas. So I really appreciate that. I'm trying to I want to go back to something you said, because it's very helpful just to understand the underlying dynamics. That L is a result of distortion. Is there evidence? It's really two questions. Is there evidence that we're getting clustering of incomes around those cliffs? And that would be evidence that our tax system is distorting income. I mean, because I know we've had issues around benefit cliffs and concentrations before. And is there a reason, instead of stepping down in percent, like 5% increments, you can't just run it as a continuous variable? Is that just hopelessly complex?
It'd be really complicated. It'd be
Okay,
algebra.
then answer. Okay, the answer.
We use a little algebra on the social security exemption phase out, but it's okay because it's buried in income
Yeah,
taxes.
yeah.
It doesn't really matter, but this
Yeah.
is something that people need to understand,
Yeah.
so we can't patch it with algebra. But on the first question about the income thresholds, yes, the last time I looked at it, there was clustering, which is problematic. The household income form is kind of tries to capture everything under the sun. So, you know, one of the reasons that I think it's problematic is that people who have, you know, tax guidance coming to them can game it. Whereas people who don't have tax guidance, you know, are left to the weird cliffs in the system. So, yeah, I think that's problematic at cliffs.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So I really appreciate you taking the time to explain that.
Thank you, Jake.
Thank you.
Now we're going to shift gears again, and we're going to talk about appraisals and classification. Jill Ritter.
I will be joining Bill. Next to some, sorry. And we have two different testimony documents. One responding to the committee's latest draft on the reappraisal work, and then one on the classifications. Is there a place that you would prefer starting? In the meantime, for the record, I'm Rebecca Samaroff, Deputy Commissioner at the Tax Department.
And I'm Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Tax Department.
Appraisals.
Reappraisal is great. Okay, I am going to share a document, which is also listed under my name on the committee page. Great. So I don't think much of this will come as a surprise to anyone who has listened to me in this chair before, listened to us in this chair before. A lot of similar feedback on the latest draft of the reappraisal work. But this time a little more highly organized in a written testimony document. One thing I want to say is that we absolutely continue supporting the conversation about regionalizing reappraisals. We're excited about this conversation. But the latest draft, similar to other drafts, has a lot of foregone conclusions about PBR taking over reappraisals. It really codifies the details of those decisions, and these are specific decisions that we really believe needs more time and work with stakeholders before committing them into law now. And as I said, just reemphasizing that stakeholder engagement and buy-in before legislating these details will only improve the chances of success of this. A reminder about timing is that there's really not a rush to legislate these details this session because of the work that this committee did 2 years ago through Act 68 of 2023. There was like a really nice flow of reappraisal activity going on contracted through 2030. So there's nothing, we don't want to, intercept those contracts, those active municipal contracts right now with, stopping that system and layering over a new regional system. We have effective dates in this bill that we've agreed to that kind of lets the current municipal contracts play out. And so, given that time, we would really scroll down a little bit here, would really like to use the time we have to engage with the stakeholder working group, which this bill does contemplate and create, learn from our municipal partners and valuation professionals that actually do this work on the ground, and explore all the options for meeting our shared vision of having a RAD reappraisal district, which is all reappraising under one reappraisal contract. It feels like a missed opportunity not to engage with the folks doing the work on the ground today to find out if there are ways to do this beyond just PBR expanding into these organizational regions and taking on this work all ourselves.
Are you?
I can keep going. Yeah. So I do want to propose an alternative approach to legislating the reappraisal regionalization. I think it does make sense to have some teeth in the bill to hold us all accountable to continue marching towards this regional reappraisal. I would pitch a more simplified framework that we can save off this great detailed legislation, but pass something much more simplified this year that makes use of the time we have to create a system that we think would have a much better chance of success, informed by the folks doing the work today. We would be happy, by the way, to provide draft language to this committee as early as tomorrow morning if it got the nod that would be a valuable and interesting direction to go in. If you want to commit the rest of our minutes between now and then to bring this to the committee. So that language, if folks are open to exploring this direction, would keep the sections that create or keep the creation of the RADs, the reappraisal districts, which in this current draft is based on county or could also be tied to the to be determined school districts. We'd want to add language requiring that the properties within each RAD would be reappraised every 6 years under one single contract, with some wiggle room unless otherwise directed by the PBR director in case we have transition issues to manage. But we really feel like that one RAD, one contract mandate would be the teeth that this process needs to make sure we're coming back next session with a plan to achieve that, because that would be in law and need work to get there. And then we could beef up the requirements for the working group, which is currently in this draft, to report back January 2026 with a recommendation and implementation plan for accomplishing a regional contract structure. This could include the state and municipal roles, who's taking what, staffing and funding needs, and the appeal structure, which also there's a lot of details on the appeals here that I think would just be easier to think about if we knew, had more information about what the new structure looks like. So in addition to these, we could, tax department would welcome additional annual reports on the progress towards a regionalized system, which would be effective in 2030. And, just, speaking again to the amount of time we have in between now and then, we could be in the same room next session, and if you all hated, the proposal of the working group, you would absolutely still have time to pass the legislation that's being contemplated today. But, we in tax department, PBR would have a lot more information about, the work that the committee is contemplating us taking on. So we'd be much better positioned to, respond intelligently there. And also we might have learned about an alternative structure that's more like, a cooperative model of municipalities coming together under one reappraisal contract that isn't a full state takeover as this bill contemplates. So that's my alternative pitch.
So, in an unusual turn of events, Representative Pointheiser has her hand up, but she's on the screen.
Hi, nice to see you all.
Oh. Wait a minute.
And thank you for the flowers, they just arrived. Rebecca, I am wondering, we have sort of a lot of competing pressures about moving very fast and moving very slowly and considering stakeholders and making decisions, as I know you're aware. And so if we were slowing down this particular, and I think it's really important that we keep all the tracks moving in an aligned way to make sure we have a good final result. And so I'm curious if we slowed down this particular thread a little bit, or this train, in order to get the stakeholder engagement you're looking at. Do you think that we would still be able to sort of get to the same place on the same timeline that we're contemplating right now?
I do. I do see us having the flexibility to do this in the same timeline. Absolutely.
Great, thanks.
So I'd like to say one more
That
thing.
language would be great then.
That's what I thought she was gonna say.
Yeah. Right.
Except-
staff members listening right now.
Except the chair who just went off the screen. She prefers the reports back in December, not January.
I do. I think January reports are very hard to be responsive and read in a meaningful way. So yes, thank you very much, Bill.
Representative Higley.
Mr. Chair, thanks. It was a number of weeks ago when you folks were in here, the question was asked whether or not PBR has the capabilities and personnel to do what's all in this bill. Any look at that since then in regards to the number, you're gonna at least need 6 new district advisors, plus all the staff and even where's the money gonna come from for these reappraisals? Any thoughts on that?
So all very good questions. Yeah, and to be clear, the 6 district advisors that we have right now already have very full-time jobs. So I want to caution whenever we're talking about like the work involved here, it is a huge amount of people and money that we do not currently have. It's a pretty small team of people. We work really hard. We are doing the equalization study. There's day-to-day work that the district advisors are doing with every single municipality, right? They're each assigned a region of the state and working with those towns to do everything from like exemptions, current use, TIF, all these different things. So they do play a somewhat like sort of, we help facilitate and work with municipalities to like provide feedback on their contracts for reappraisals and things like that. And then on the other end of the reappraisal, we certainly do some like statistical analysis to make sure that it's met the mark there. But this is adding a lot more work. So it's not like we could just take the 6 district advisors and take care of this.
Right.
There's work that's still on their plates that we would have access to, that we can't not do still. Yeah.
And again, my concern has always been, for me to pass something, even though it's down the road a piece, I'd still like to know what we're talking about to some degree. Because I need to weigh, I still disagree with even the intent language in here, because I think the 3 intent clauses here, we currently do. We keep grand lists up to date. We're consistent and standardized across the state to some degree. I mean, I don't know what else you're looking for there, but anyway, I just think that we're there on most of the intent anyway. And to do such a huge change, and what's the cost going to be, and what's it going to be? Anyway, just Just my comments, thanks.
Yeah, and I'm really glad to see who you folks are hearing from after us, right? So Linda Sherman from Vala, and I know that Mr. Potfelder's here, like you're hearing from the folks who are actually out there doing the work. And I do think, to Rebecca's point, things are definitely moving in the right direction from where we sit, right? We're doing almost 40 reappraisals in 2025, we being the towns and the contractors. And we're booked out through 2030, there's reappraisals being scheduled. So like things are moving in the right direction. I think that the holes we need to fill are how do we build up the employees, frankly, whether they're municipal or private or state, to do this work, because we don't have a pool of folks hanging out there ready to do this. So we would love to like beef up however we can to help train people and get more people into this field, and that takes time. But I do feel like the momentum is moving in the right direction.
Representative Feltus.
My concern is the cost over time of the additional persons that will be required, as well as the state taking over the cost of doing the reappraisals of these towns. Currently, the state helps some, obviously, but each town spends their other couple of $100,000 in order to do it. So it's just an extra obligation on the part of the state. How are we going to pay for that within state resources? And then I'd like to understand what the benefit of doing all this is against that cost. I mean, I understand there's inconsistencies perhaps in our current system of how we do things. But is it satisfactory? It may not be perfect, but is it satisfactory? Have we, instituted the CLA and these other mechanisms to try to even things out so we can at least make some judgments? My concern is the cost and the benefit. Is this, sounds to me like a tremendous cost. Will that really lead us? Is that cost worth the benefit of having a slightly better appraisal system?
Representative Holcomb.
I probably also have a rhetorical question, because I think we're all grappling with is the squeeze worth the juice? And I like the idea of making use of the time we have to create a system with better success. I like having the work informed by the people who are doing the work today, maximizing success again. And I'm juxtaposed, and I really appreciate your comment that giving a ton of new work, there's a lot of new work in every transformation, right? And giving a lot of new work without time to a small work group can become very burdensome. It might impair other work as well. And I'm just trying to reconcile this, which seems very reasonable and thoughtful, and I want to support it, with the way we're handling the school transformation, where if we don't have boundaries by this year, we're going to veto it. I mean, because that work's actually more complicated than this work. So how is it that work is possible and this can't be done? Like, I'm trying to understand the contradiction between the way we're talking about this and the way we're talking about school district transformation. And frankly, I'm really struggling with that.
I think the tax rate implications for the, current education system, as legislators y'all dealt with last year, are, it's my understanding, is really the driving force behind the pace that's being asked for this year in the education space.
That's going to cost, like, everything on the table, including the governor's plan, has huge cost involved in that transition. That's not going to lower tax rates. So there's an urgency around rearranging the furniture quickly without taking input from the people who are doing the work, without making sure it's actually going to lead to measurable improvements. And I just really, this seems like a piece of cake compared to what we're asking them to do on the other side. I'm sorry. I appreciate you. I've worked with Jill forever. She's amazing.
Yeah.
And there's a real inconsistency here.
Yeah, well, we're tax people, well, and Jill in her other roles as a bit of an education person as well.
Jill does everything. I'm trying to figure out what Jill does.
Yeah, I am a tax person. So, I've heard compelling points from our current education secretary, and I know you have a very important perspective on that, the pace and those points as well. So I can't really speak to, those motivations there, but I do appreciate the taking advantage of the pause that we kind of have built into this transformation already to do our best to make this regionalization attempt successful.
Representative Kimball.
I'm sensing a consensus that it's okay to slow down. I just want to ask you a couple of questions.
On everything.
One of the things that we discussed with setting up regional assessment districts is trying not to set up brand new political entities. And what you had mentioned, Rebecca, is just maybe there's cooperative agreements that can be formed between municipalities to do this work instead of PVR taking it on. I'm still worried about creating those different political subdivisions in order to get that done. It could be cooperative agreements. I'm not sure what that looks like.
Right.
But it could be that you come back if the committee feels that way, with also this recommendation that you use the regional assessment districts and PVR administers the regional reappraisals. That could be one possible outcome of what your study is, right?
Yeah, that might be the most agreed upon as the most efficient way forward if there's not, other cooperative.
Right.
Facilitate that.
The other question I guess I had was gone now. It's gone. I may come back.
Okay,
Awesome.
thank you.
Right. Should we spin around and put on our classification hats?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Hang on. Sorry. We've received testimony and written testimony from some listers or assessors, and it's very informed. We haven't heard from towns that don't have assessors or listers. Did I say assessors or listers or assessors? Because they struggle to find someone to do the work. And I guess I want to make sure that in our discussions, we're representing both groups. And that we've got, 129 reappraisals on order, and then another 29 or something that are still out of compliance. So I guess I'm really concerned for those folks that don't have that in-house talent as to how a delay just doesn't help them.
Yeah, I struggle with that too, because there are plenty of towns that have folks who can do this work, who have contracted with someone and it works well. There are towns that are sending us notes saying, we've been putting out an RFP over and over and over, and we can't get anyone to reply, or we can, but 2032 or something. I mean, so I would love to find a solution. That's where the regionalization seems like has the best hope of how can we help the smaller towns that aren't able to find someone, work with their neighbors, right? Rather than sort of us all working in our isolation and maybe having 0.2 person here and a 0.2 person here and a 0.2 person there. If there is something we can do to kind of band together and make sure those smaller towns can get help. So we do what we can, right? We sort of try to connect them, and I think having the cycle again, I know folks have heard me say it ad nauseum, but where the town can look and see who else around them is reappraising intent and see if they can hop into that contract, or maybe it's more appetizing for the contractor. And again, Mr. Podbrook could certainly speak to this more than I. That's their bread. That's a huge part of what these folks do, is help Vermont small towns do reappraisal. Right. So how can we literally help them get a contract, and whether it's that it's part of a consortium or it's that we have some sort of a sharing model, but we do need to do something to help the smaller towns that need it. But yeah, you won't hear from, right? So there's times of the year we'll send things out and there's nobody on the other end to get reappraisal. So yeah, but I don't think that anything we could do at this moment could solve that better now than 9 months from now.
Just a quick, it's not just small towns either. I think Barry struggled to find an assessor for years. We tried to team up with Montpelier to find one to do our reassessment too. So it's an absolutely valid point about small towns too, but it's a statewide problem, not regardless of the size of your municipality. So I think it's, extra burdensome on those small towns, but it's an everywhere problem.
All right, we ready for the switcheroo?
All right. There we go. Wow. Not a lot has changed in this draft since the last time I was in this chair speaking to it. So, nothing has dramatically changed again about tax department's position besides a little more well articulated in a Word document for everyone's reviewing pleasure. We oppose adding 9 new non-homestead classifications to the grand list. We can't administer this successfully. I'm very confident about that. We can't today, we can't in the near future, especially as we're prioritizing establishing these regionalized reappraisal districts. as tax administrator is always a big red flag when we're trying to consider and implement tax concepts that are completely novel. Classifications in other jurisdictions aren't based on present day use, which is what these classifications consider. There is an exception that I know has been reviewed in this committee in Maui County in Hawaii, but that's built on top of a very strict and comprehensive zoning framework that doesn't exist here in Vermont. So there's already basically like use-based classification of that property. We have a big uphill battle to get there with these classifications. So we have some of these came up in kind of like our itemized administrative concerns last time we were in here, but just broadly, just want to be clear that we have significant fairness concerns with the policy decision not to accommodate mixed use in properties, which many properties have mixed use. We talked about examples last time we were in this chair where like two buildings could be 95% identical right next to each other, and the whole property could have a different tax treatment if that remaining 5% was used differently. One example is if there was an apartment versus an office, in the remaining, like upstairs room of that apartment. So that's a big change. There's also, I don't know, like an example, if we think about the, this is like relevant to a court case from a couple of years ago, and I'm not actually sure if the Vermont College of Fine Arts, like what the status is right now, but like an exempt organization like the Fine Arts College would be a public use classification, under this framework. But as soon as they rent one building to another group, then it becomes a commercial endeavor, and so now the whole property is considered commercial. This is another example of where mixed use kind of becomes significant. I also want to note that, like, unlike the one classification we have today, the homestead, in many cases, property owner and property user are not the same person. So the property owner is the taxpayer. Their tax bill will be impacted by the person using that property, how they're using it. There's some detail here that improvements are often built on leased land. So the owner of the real estate and the owner of the improvements might be different entities. They're both listed on the grant list, and that's kind of something that's a little unclear in this draft, like how whether use is determined by the landowner or the investment owner. We find it particularly confusing that some of the major classifications in this draft are determined based on the prior calendar year, while the rest is based on the current calendar year. So there's retrospective classifications for apartments based on the full prior year landlord certificate, and also for homesteads, which are based on the prior year's homestead declaration. This is like in addition to the complication that landlord certificates are specifically designed for a program that administers a credit for very low income renters. They're not currently like a full census of all landlords. While all landlords are required to submit them, we only know about compliance for landlord certificates when someone files for a renter credit. And that's a small population of renters compared to the full rental populations. Relying purely on landlord certificates, I don't think would be successful there. And also we've just, heard so much about the benefits of simplifying the property tax system, and this significantly complicates it. So these are all the reasons why we are not supportive of these classifications. We've spoken a lot about the complications of administratively, policy-wise, of just pursuing like any one classification. So if this is like a direction that the committee is set on going, I really recommend identifying like one present day property use category and like pursuing that with all the detail it deserves. So, the definition, identification, sorry, I have a word page thing going here. If there's something you want to carve out of the non-homestead pool, I think concentrating on the administrative and definitional complexity for just one would be plenty work for us to do collectively as policymakers and administrators. So all in there.
Representative Maslin.
Yeah, question. You're saying that 9's a little much. And I wondered if 9 might be a little much to get a little complicated. How about, just to throw a number out, how about 4? Well, maybe there are good reasons to differentiate between property part types here, if we can figure out a straightforward and simplistic way to do it. So I was a little leery of 9, not to discredit the people that came up with that. But you're talking about administrative burden of dealing with 9 property tax. I wonder, so if the present number is not enough, just to pick up an administrative number, I mean, what if it was 4 or something? I mean, it's just a question, and I haven't.
Yeah.
For it, it's not my job.
I've been beaten down and I will concede that one additional classification, I feel like would be a lift we could accomplish together successfully. You're very tempted. It's very alluring to go up to 2, but I'm gonna stick with my recommendation in the written testimony.
I wanted to hear what you said.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note too, that there's 2 factors that go into what your property tax bill is, right? It's the valuation and the tax rate. So if properties are identified under for valuation purposes, right, for highest and best use, they're already going to be valued and then therefore taxed at a higher rate if they're higher value property. So it's sort of creating a second lever when the valuation already accommodates the value of that particular property, and then it's taxing at that rate rather than changing the rate.
Representative Wasazzi.
Yes, I appreciate your comments about fairness, because creating a fair tax code is something I believe very strongly in. And I would argue right now that our current system is not fair at all. When you have, for example, my small businesses in downtown Barrie, who have 1 storefront and a couple apartments up top, are paying the same tax rate as, for example, a ski resort, which is owned by an out-of-state multimillionaire who lives in Colorado. When we have our mom and pop landlords who have their single family home and own 1 or 2 other buildings in town, paying the same as giant property developers who can, throw up luxury condos. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts on how maintaining the current system is fair to Vermonters who are trying to just pay their bills and get by because cost of living is so high, paying the same rate as folks who have, frankly, money falling out of their pockets.
Well, not to be difficult, but I think you just illustrated the point I was trying to make too, right? Is like there is already a valuation that represents the higher value of those properties. So the rate might be the same, but what the rate is being applied to might be very different. I'm not sure how else to capture that and accommodate that.
I think we could accommodate it by changing the rates, but understand and appreciate your answer.
Yeah, I mean, we'll just say like conceptually, I like absolutely follow and follow the logic. It's the, the items that I've listed here, as a tax administrator to like there's policing present day use is not something we do currently. It's going to be a huge lift to do it for all 370,000-ish parcels we have in the state. It's not something that's done in other states. So, responsibly, I think I have a lot of skepticism and concern. We're used to being successful at what we try to implement at the tax department, which is amazing. It's a really great era. And we're really proud of that. So just want to be very clear when we think that something is not going to be able to be implemented fairly across the state. And when there's major tax consequences associated with a very new process of deciding how each property is used in real time, I think there's, huge opportunities for inequity.
Just to follow up on that too, I completely agree and appreciate your points about practicality, which I think speaks back to Representative Holcomb's earlier points of the practicality of moving to a foundation formula and new maps in 1 year, but not in this sense. And I just want to push back slightly on your use of the word policing, because we're not talking about policing the use of property. We're just talking about classifying it under a more appropriate way for how it's being used. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, perhaps unfair use of policing.
Representative Holcomb.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure, other people have different reasons. One of the reasons this is even a conversation is we have many communities where the tax rate for houses that are left empty the entire year is 50, 60 cents lower than a homestead. There's only one way that goes over time, and it isn't good. It isn't good in terms of revenue, and it isn't good for our population base. So we have a real problem that is bad for Vermont. And if not this, then what? Because we have to address that And I don't know if when we remodel, we're gonna have different tax rates, assuming for the different districts. But I think, maybe we need to be looking at whether we I would be curious to also see modeled what would happen if we let the non-homestead rate tie to the homestead rate, or, went back by district, because this is not okay. It's just not okay to reward people who leave a house that used to be occupied by a family with kids empty year round so they can use it 1 or 2 weekends a year. And it's cheaper for them to do that than it is the person working 3 jobs to try to stay in town.
Yeah, I agree.
Not okay.
Vacancy feels like
Not
a crime
okay.
in this housing market. And the thing about moving to a foundation formula where the homestead rate is not tied to a local spending decision is it completely, I think, paves the way to legislate if you want a situation where the non-homestead rate is never lower than the homestead rate. Or
And we don't know what it is. And I think part of the frustration you're hearing is I feel like people have been trying to get at it through rental registries. We know how that went, through this, we know how that's going. We need if not this, then what? You know what the policy problem is. Help us work this out.
Yeah, I'd say focus on the priorities that I'm hearing here, and we might have a shot of doing this, helping our municipal valuation professionals do this like in a way that is equitably applied all across the
I want to
state.
address this problem though.
So, Mr. Chair, I just have one question that's a little nerdy. When is the current use of a property and not current use value appraisal system?
Present.
Present day use, when is that ever really higher than highest and best use? It seems like it's very rare where the present use of a property is higher than the highest and best use.
If the question would lead to a higher value or
Yes, so right now our assessments are done on a highest and best use, not on a current use or presentation. So I just wonder if it's already using the highest value in most cases, as opposed to doing present use.
Yeah, in most cases. So this would be creating 2 ways a property gets treated. The vast majority of the time, there might be some overlap, but if you eliminate them, most properties also have some combination.
Yeah.
Right, so we categorize them one way for the equalization study, but categorize them 100% as one or the other would be a big change. But yeah, there's a lot of properties right now that have some combination, but you value it accordingly based on what it can be used for, right? Even if it's an empty farm with nothing going on, it's a farm with a barn, the facilities and things like that. So that's what it's put on the ground list as, was it's empty or not. But asking listers and assessors to every year determine what is being used for, and if that is different, is a lot of work and appeals. And there's a lot of properties in Vermont that are used for a few different things, and they don't fall neatly into these 9 buckets. Then you're creating, it just feels like a recipe for sort of a constant sort of conflict and disagreement on that. But
Yeah.
right, yeah, my house is my house is my house. I think I've talked about it in this committee before. There's a house in our neighborhood that's empty, but they're using it for their their overflow of their inventory for their small business. Still on the grand list as a single family home, right? Does this mean that we would need to identify it as commercial or industrial?
The warehouse would be a lot less valuable. Yeah.
So Chair Kornheiser has her hand up.
Hi, can you stop sharing your screen for a second so I can see?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I heard you saying that you also want to make this work. And if we had fewer categories, significantly fewer categories, we could probably find a way to make it work. I want to reveal to do the first draft, to share this with the committee, I knew there had to be a certain number of categories. And I figured if we started with 3, people would move to 9 over the course of the session. And if we started with 9, people would probably move to 3 over the course of the session, because that is how people are. And so I think it's really interesting to think about the idea of consolidating to fewer classifications. So thank you for that. And I imagine that many of the stakeholders that are going to join us after you will advocate for similar. I'm curious about your recommendations on mixed use. Would you recommend that we stick to sort of how homestead and non-homestead are done right now for mixed use? With just like, or do you have another recommendation for that?
I think it would, well, I'll let Jill speak to this too, of course, but like, I think it would very much depend on what classifications, you know, end up as being the ones the committee is considering. But I think that answer could be different depending on what classification you want to prioritize. But I don't think there's anything, I'm not aware of any administrative hurdles to the way we're handling the homestead, non-homestead mixed use situation now. Pretty
The
simple.
duplex scenario with someone living on one side of the duplex. Okay.
And those are self-attestations, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because they're filing as a percentage that is a homestead, percentage of the square footage of homestead, correct?
Yeah, or the flip of that, you know, you file your homestead declaration and you identify the percentage that's being used as either rental or commercial property.
Yeah.
And what I also hear you saying is that we need to be lining up with some attestation system or sort of easily validated system so that it's not up to PVR to be validating or to be annually sort of checking on each of these properties, right? There needs to be some external piece of paper for these categories.
Again, it might depend a bit on what the classification, what, you know, a narrow classification would be specifically. And then I do just want to remind that it's local assessing officials that would be doing this validation under like the current draft as well. But attestation is certainly something that's you know, underpinning what we do for homestead and non-homestead. So that's one we're familiar with, and there's, you know, clear responsibilities, penalties, incentives for taxpayers to be doing that. There's compliance challenges depending on which classifications we're talking about with an attestation as well. It's by no means a silver bullet, which is why, you know, for like years now, we've been coming in, you know, to talk about the complexities of things like identifying and taxing, you know, a second home, for example.
Thanks.
Representative Higley.
We can move on, Mr. Chair. We're lacking time. I got a minute.
Got a minute.
I can just give you one example. So in our latest grievance hearings, we had an individual come in and moved up and was livid that we had a certain percentage of their properties in business use. And we finally said, we don't do that. We get that through, you know, that tax form, and they finally realized that their tax person did it. But until that happened, we were denied unbelievable that they were going to move out of state, that you know, they thought they could move into the state and have a little business and blah, blah, blah. And now we're charging a non-residential rate, which was, you know, I think I added up, it was like $60 difference, you know. But anyway, just an example of what we go through now. And with all these classifications, it would be a chore for us as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all so much.
This committee needs a 5-minute